This is the podcast overview for the objectives in Chapter 7, Anxiety, Anger, and Depression. So first, you want to be familiar with the various aspects of anxiety and the different correlated terms. Talks about fear and worry, and how do we differentiate those from anxiety. And then you're going to dive into differentiating between the different anxiety disorders as detailed by the DSM. I just want you to note that the book mentions the DSM-4, and the DSM has been updated since the publication of the text, so it is now in the DSM-5. So just know that the classifications are still the same, that hasn't changed, so all the information is still accurate. But you're going to be looking at generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, phobias, OCD, and PTSD. You're going to be looking at the symptoms of each of those, as well as prevalence rates and sort of who is most at risk for each of those and how they're different from one another. And then it will get into looking at treatment for anxiety disorders. How does one manage anxiety, and what are the various approaches to treatment? We have everything from the pharmacological treatment to behavioral and cognitive treatment for anxiety. Also looking at what anxiety management might look like on a daily basis in one's daily routine. What are some things that people can be doing to mitigate the effects of anxiety if they struggle with that, and what are some different techniques and tactics that they can be using. And here's where abdominal breathing comes into play, and have a video this week on that you'll want to check out that has to do with that. Then we're going to dive into talking about anger, explaining the emotional components of the anger response and what anger can be associated with. And we'll be going back to some previous material that we talked about with the triggering of the fight or flight response, and how this is triggered when we are angry, and how anger and the rise in anger today is contributing to diseases like heart disease. And so there's that connection between anger and coronary heart disease. And then looking at the difference between the psychiatric disorder of intermittent explosive disorder and how that's different from just regular anger. What are the components that make it different, that make it a classification of a psychiatric disorder, and who experiences this, what types of individuals are more at risk for this. Then we'll turn to looking at anger management and the various techniques that are used within that. Catharsis theory, stress inoculation, passive-aggressive behavior, and how one can work through all of that with different techniques in anger management. You'll want to be also then familiar with the area of depression, which is the last kind of prong of the chapter. Be looking at the DSM classification of depression and its various components. How is it connected to stress? How is it related to previous discussion of the diathesis stress model, which is kind of a model that looks at the origin of depression and why it might exist, looks at it from a biopsychosocial perspective, and differentiates depression from major depressive disorder. And again, I have some videos I posted this week diving into detail with that, so you'll want to make sure that you look at those. Then the connection between depression and stress. Why is it so hard for us to handle our stress, and how might that be connected to depression and depression symptomology? What are the links between one's ability to manage stress and depression? Then we'll dive into some medical and therapeutic treatments and interventions for depression, what types of therapy exists, how do people deal with depression in general. So some general strategies that might be good for individuals who feel somewhat depressed. And some of these verge more into the realm of dysthymia, which is mild depression and not the major depressive disorder, the MDD. Lastly, you want to look at understanding the cognitive elements of depression. What kinds of thoughts and thought patterns make for depression? What does one's attitude and thinking have to do with depression? And what might be strategies for dealing with those? Lastly, we'll be looking at Maddox's critique of the DSM for its illness ideology and its connection to positive mental health. Looking at what is positive mental health and complete mental health. What does that look like, and why is this kind of a lacking area? As explained in the DSM, that's where his critique comes into play. And then what are the categories and descriptions for the categorical diagnosis of mental health? And again, here is the area of flourishing that we talked about earlier in the semester. So understand what is the categorical diagnosis of mental health. What does that tell us? What does that entail? Be able to distinguish the various parts of that. And that will conclude the chapter on anxiety, anger, and depression.